Before starting to write a novel, some writers will start with very detailed outline. They'll have it all plotted out, all figured out. Um, then other writers will just simply start with an idea and nothing more than that. So writers like James Patterson or Dan Brown or John Grisham, they'll all spend a considerable amount of time working on the outline long before they put the first sentence down on paper or head for the keyboard. Um, Yet other writers like Stephen King and Margaret Atwood and Neil Gaiman, writers like that, will have little or no formal plot to begin with. They'll just start with an idea and nothing more. So the question is detailed plotting a more efficient way to write without the inevitable stumbling around in the dark, writing thousands of words that will never make it into the final draft? Or on the other hand, does the freedom to develop the idea allow for the true story to really come through? And does it invariably lead to a better book? Hi, I'm Gerald Kilby, and I'm a full-time science fiction author. And over the course of writing 12 novels and a few short stories, I've experimented with both no outline, just simply an idea, and very, very detailed outlines. And I'm going to tell you what I've learned. But first, let's talk about outliners, and specifically James Patterson. You can see here in his beautiful home office, all those folders on shelves, they're all books that have been outlined in various states of being written at the moment. So there's a lot of them there, but just wait till you see this. Each one of those drawers is full of even more books that are ready to be written. All outlines, all labeled, all very organized. In fact, he's so good at plotting and outlining that he has now got a bevy of co-authors that help him write all these books. He can literally just give them the outline, and everything there is for the co-author to execute that vision. It's the chapters, beats, scenes, the whole 9 yards is in there. Now clearly outlining has its advantages because James Patterson consistently tops the #1 highest paid author list. In 2018 he made about 86 million, so that's pretty good going. And he's even co-writing with people like the former president Bill Clinton, believe it or not. Now let's get Stephen King's take on the matter.
But in any case, John Irving, when he was talking to a bunch of would-be writers one time, said that the first thing he does with a book is write the last line of that book. And I heard that and I just went, like that. Because to me, that's kind of like spoiling the fun. I like to start with a little bit of an idea. They come from different places. Sometimes they stick around and you want to do something. Sometimes they don't. But the idea is to start with something and just start to go with it, And that's the joy of finding things out, of having characters that just sort of walk on and become a big part of the story.
He's quoted as saying, and I quote it here, "Outlines are the last resource of bad fiction writers who wish to God they were writing master's theses." So clearly Stephen King is not a big believer in outlines. He just simply writes from an idea. And he's no slouch. He has 88 books to his name so far, probably more. He doesn't really know how many books he's written, and 34 of them have been turned into movies, and that's excluding all the TV shows that he's produced. And in 2018, he was the third highest paying author, and that's writing all without an outline. So the question remains, which is better? Is outlining, detailed outline better, or is it simply best to start with an idea and nothing more? Well, I've experimented with both over the course of writing 12 novels, and here's pretty much what I've learned. If I consider the first book I wrote that with no outline and no real fundamental understanding of story structure. Just a vague idea of what makes a good book from having read so many books in the past. I had an understanding of what made a good story, beginning, middle, and end, rising tension, and so on, but I had no understanding of story structure per se. But that's okay. You got to start somewhere. But that book took me 3 years to write, and it was a big, cumbersome blob with plots within plots and minor characters that took over the story and muscled in and created their own story within a story. So in the end, to beat it into some sort of reasonable shape, I had to ditch thousands and thousands of words that had no meaning really on the full story. And in the end, I actually split it up into 2 books because there was a plot within a plot. So, but to be fair, I did it. I got to the end. I finished it, and I was immensely proud of writing that. But for the next book, I decided that I really needed to get my act together for this. I couldn't do that again. So I studied everything I could on writing and story structure and character arc, and everything I could find I read and I studied it and I applied it to the next book. And that book was a lot easier to write. It took me about 11 months to write it. And then for my third book, I knew even more. It took me about 5 months to write. So clearly, setting out outlines and having some understanding of story structure and plotting it out before I started was a much more efficient way to write. I could write faster, and at the end I'd have less words wasted. So I could see the benefit of outlining, and so much so that I began to get into more detailed spreadsheets and more detailed outlining and heading more towards the kind of James Patterson way of writing. However, by the 6th or 7th book, I was spending more and more time doing outlining than I was doing the writing. I would create these complex spreadsheets with all the characters, all the chapters, the scenes, the beats, everything was in there. But once I started writing, no sooner had I written 2-3 chapters, then the entire book would change because I'd have a new idea and I go, "Ooh, that's interesting. I think I'll go off down that direction," and then I'd have to go back and re-edit the outline. And then I'd go back and write a few more chapters and get another idea and then go back and then re-edit the outline, to the point where I was getting really frustrated with this, because then I was trying to contain my writing so that I wouldn't upset my carefully crafted outline. So after a while I began to feel that, this was becoming a chore, that I was losing the joy in writing, and I was wondering to myself, well, what can I do? What is the answer to this? So I dialed back on the detailed outlining and focused more just on creating maybe a page or 2 of bullet points that closely resembled, or vaguely resembled, I should say, the chapters of the book. And then as I was writing and things would change, I would just go back and make notes in my outline as to what the change might be. But even that, in a sense, needed constant amending, and I was still thinking about what the outline was and how I had structured the book. And then eventually I came across a guy called Dean Wesley Smith, who's a prolific author, maybe 200 novels. And I suppose you could class him to some degree as a journeyman writer. He writes under his own name, but he also would write under as a gun for hire for, say, series like Star Wars and Men in Black, and to name it a few. But he knows how to write, that's for sure. And he wrote a book called Writing into the Dark, which essentially is a manifesto for this methodology that's used by King and Atwood and Gaiman. Short book, but after reading, I said, look, what the heck, let's just give this a go. So I started my last book, actually, with nothing more than simply an idea. I kind of knew who the characters were. I had the idea, but I had no idea. I had no clue as to what the plot was going to be or where it was going to end up. I had a beginning, just about. I had no middle, and I had no end. And to be honest, that was the easiest and most enjoyable book I've ever written. So what's going on here is the question. Which is better? Is winging it better, or is plotting better? Well, my answer might surprise you, actually, because I think both are equally important, and here's why. When I considered what made me push through the very first book I wrote, it was the fact that I didn't know what the story was a major part of my enthusiasm for writing it. I found that every day when I'd finish writing, I would be thinking about the characters and the plot and where they were and what the tension was and what the suspense was and what the drama was and what particular situation they found themselves in and how they were going to get themselves out of that. So I was constantly thinking about this plot and my story and my characters, and I would enter this kind of fantasy world, and I would spend so much time in my mind figuring it out, and then I would come up with some idea, and then I'd be dying just to get back to the keyboard again to get that down. Or even I might come up with a scene and go, that's a really nice idea, I think I'll stick that in the book, and I would make a note of that scene, and I'd say, now I'm going to try and get my characters from where they are now to that scene at some point. How can I do that? So, in a sense, I was writing like a reader. A reader doesn't know where the story is going until they read it. And what keeps the reader interested in the story is this idea that they need to find out what's going to happen. They need to find out, will the character redeem themselves? Will the character succeed? What's going to happen in the next chapter? And as a writer, particularly if you start with nothing more than an idea, the enthusiasm is there because you yourself want to know what happens. You don't know, so you sit down and you write the characters and you write the story and you write the scene, and the story unfolds for you as you write. Okay, and that makes it very, very interesting and quite joyful, really, in terms of writing. Is what makes writing interesting. But having said all that, what I did in the previous 10 or so books that I wrote was that I learned about story structure and character arc and the dark night of the soul and the midpoint and the climax and all that sort of stuff. I learned all about that. And if you think in terms of, say, a composer is not going to just decide, I think I'm going to be a composer, and off they go and compose a symphony. No, they don't. They have an intimate understanding of the sound and capabilities of every instrument that's in that orchestra before they even begin to create a symphony. Or even if you consider, say, a musician, before a musician can play a piece, they must first learn all the notes. And then when they learn all the notes of that piece, they forget them. And only then can they play the piece with feeling, because they're not thinking about the process. They're just going for it. So in a sense, those first 10 books is where I served my time, where I paid my dues, and I committed that knowledge, in a sense, to muscle memory. So when you hear of writers like King who say, I just write from simply an idea, they have millions upon millions upon millions of words under their belt. They have written so many stories that they have an intimate understanding of story structure. They know how to structure a story before they even start. They don't need a plot. It will find its own way as they write. So my thinking on it is, for me at least, to sustain my writing career, the joy of writing needs to be paramount. I need to want to go and create that story. So that's why essentially what I do now is I write like a reader, where the next chapter is unknown and it's waiting to be discovered. That way I think about my story more. I ponder its complexities, its characters, where it might be going. I'm spending time in that story in my mind. And all that kind of intrigue that I build up while I'm thinking about it brings me back to the keyboard, so that I can find out who or what is behind that door. So thanks for watching, but please remember, these are just my thoughts on writing. There are many other equally valid arguments out there, so take what you will and disregard what you must, but ultimately find your own path. So you can check out me and more of my books at geraldmkilby.com. And thank you for watching. See you next time.